Good morning. My name's Jill Callister. I'm the President of IPAA Victoria, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome all of you here this morning to our budget breakfast. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present and to any other Aboriginal people who are with us this morning. To anyone who's attending your first IPAA event, please enjoy it, and I hope it's the first of many. I particularly want to welcome my fellow departmental secretaries, my colleagues on the IPAA board, including the Deputy President Adam Fennessy, our speakers, and all of you who've made the effort to come out very early this morning to what is actually the 20th anniversary of the IPAA Budget Breakfast. Believe it or not, we have been running this event since 1997, and it is a signature event in the IPAA calendar, and it embodies many of those values that we hold dear at IPAA. There aren't many places where the state's most senior Treasury official gets up in front of almost 1,000 of you just a few hours really after the release of the annual budget and provides an overview and an analysis of its contents. And the state budget is of course one of those things that affects us all facets of public life in Victoria, but it's rarely a simple beast. It's full of complex sums and equations which are in turn contingent on even more complicated projections and assumptions. To have the opportunity then to hear from the one person with probably the greatest grasp of all these fiscal and numerical complexities provides us with to give us a straightforward overview of its highlights is quite a privilege. But that's not the only reason that it's a signature tradition for us at IPAA. It exemplifies in many ways so much of what we aim to deliver as the connected public sector association. It's a forum to explore some of the biggest issues facing our sector. It gives a unique inside look at the funding that will drive our work over the coming year, and it provides a springboard for some critical debate on issues that impact on the lives of all Victorians. And there's been a number of really interesting announcements in the budget that I'm sure David Martin will talk about. Just a couple that I noted, a very significant response to the Royal Commission on Family Violence, a significant, probably the first time in well over a decade, investment in early childhood, another big infrastructure budget, an investment in laying the groundwork for treaty negotiations between Aboriginal Victorians and the Victorian Government. So before we begin the detailed analysis, I just want to briefly introduce our guest speaker and our facilitator. Firstly, a very warm welcome to my colleague David Martin, who's headed up the Department of Treasury and Finance here in Victoria since 2014. This is David's fourth state budget breakfast. And on behalf of IPAA, I thank him sincerely for agreeing to give us the benefit of his personal insight and wisdom into the contents of the budget so soon after its release, and of course the leadership that he provides for both his department and the Victorian Secretary's Board. We don't always agree, but we have a great way of working things through. After 4 years, he's something of a veteran in providing the fiscal and economic and policy advice for the state government. He's also worked with the Commonwealth Treasury and was a Deputy Secretary in the former Federal Department of Finance and Deregulation. So he does bring a huge amount of knowledge and experience into this aspect of public administration in Victoria. I also want to welcome our two special commentators and our host for the session that will occur after David's presentation. Our first guest this year is the Special Economic Analyst Peter Martin, who is the Economics Editor of The Age. And I also welcome back our other guest analyst, Danielle Wood, who's the Australian Perspectives Fellow at the Grattan Institute. I think you will find their perspectives on the state budget extremely interesting. And to introduce Peter and Danielle a little later on and facilitate a discussion between them and David, I'd like to welcome Dean Yates. Dean is the head of EY's Victorian Government and Public Sector Practice. He's also a member of the IPA Victoria Board, and since last year, the chair of our Audit, Finance and Risk Committee at the IPA Board. He's had a 30-year career in the Victorian, Commonwealth and Tasmanian public sectors, including serving as the Secretary of the Victorian Department of Transport, Planning and Local Infrastructure and leading the Budget and Financial Management Division at the Department of Treasury and Finance. He's well qualified to lead today's discussion, but it also gives him a chance to ask some of the very questions he might have avoided in a previous life. So in a few minutes, I'll invite David to speak, and his presentation will include some charts and graphs, but he will email us the slides and we'll make them available, so don't feel that you need to scribble everything down. Following David's presentation, Peter will offer his perspective on the broader economic context of the Victorian budget, and Danielle will briefly analyse the macro implications of the budget and how some of it may impact on broader economic priorities. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion and questions from the floor that Dean will be facilitating. So given the size of this event, we'll take the questions via our SMS system, which gives us an opportunity to get through more questions. So the number will be on the screen. Also, if you want to Twitter today, the hashtag is hashtag IPAVic. We will finish at 9 sharp, so we will move on now, and please join me in welcoming our guest speaker for this morning, the Secretary of the Department of Treasury and Finance, David Martine.
Okay, thank you, Jill, for that kind introduction, and it's great to be back at my 4th IPA budget breakfast. It's hard to believe it's now number 4. Time flies when having fun, and rest assured, putting budgets together in a bizarre way is actually fun. That clicker doesn't seem to work. Oh, there we go. So this morning I plan to cover 4 key aspects of the 2017-18 Victorian budget: the outlook for the Victorian economy, an explanation of the state's finances, risks to the economic and fiscal outlook, and an outline of the key initiatives outlined in this year's budget. There will be plenty of facts, occasional alternative fact, and I do promise to only mention Donald Trump once through the course of this morning. To begin, let me briefly touch on some highlights from this year's budget. The 2017-18 budget delivers strong budget surpluses over the next 4 years, maintains revenue growth on average above expenses growth, keeps net debt at a sustainable level of 6% of gross state product, while allowing borrowing to fund new infrastructure. In the 2017-18 budget, the government has prioritised new spending on a significant $1.9 billion investment in addressing family violence, investing in health, including $1.3 billion to meet growing demand for hospital services, more than $2 billion to fund the government's community safety statement released on the 7th of December, and $6.1 billion of new asset initiatives. The strong financial position is supported by an equally strong set of economic results. This includes robust economic growth of 3.3% in 2015-16, above the national average. The significant increase in Victoria's rate of population growth has been a key component of Victoria's relative economic strength over recent years. Victoria's population grew at 2.1% in 2015-16, compared to a national figure of just 1.4%. We've seen a very strong population inflows from all other states and territories, and an increase in net overseas migration. This represents a complete turnaround from even 10 years ago, when Victoria experienced net migration flows to all other states and territories. The strong population growth has helped Victoria's economy to be among the fastest growing in the nation. Victoria's gross state product grew by 3.3% in 2015-16, compared with the national GDP growth of 2.7%. As this chart shows, from 2010-11 onwards, Victoria's GSP growth lagged that of the nation as a whole. However, GSP growth has picked up significantly since 2014 and is outgrowing Australian GDP for the first time in a decade. This growth has been supported by strong household consumption and business and dwelling investment. Growth in exports, particularly in service exports, has also helped support robust growth in the real economy. Population growth has been a solid contributor to economic growth, and this has helped to offset the effects of lower productivity growth and participation rates that have at times proved a drag on GSP growth. As you can see on this chart, in the more recent years, the negative impact of a declining participation rate on GSP, as shown by the lighter blue bars on the chart, has reversed, helping to boost economic growth. Productivity growth has also rebounded from 2013-14, again becoming a net contributor to economic growth. Victoria's a more muted productivity growth, than in previous decades, and significant shifts in the participation rate have meant that GSP per capita has not been rising as strongly as the economy as a whole. As you can see on this chart, GSP per Victorian has actually declined at different points over the last decade. This means that the Victorian real economy in those years didn't grow as fast as the Victorian population. Currently, Victorian GSP per capita is growing at 1.41% a year, slightly higher than the national rate of 1.37%. Strong population and economic growth have helped support the strongest labour market in the nation. The supply of new workers into Victoria have been met with continued strong demand for labour, as reflected in Victoria's low unemployment rate, forecast in the budget to be 5.5% in 2017-18. Over 200,000 jobs have been created in Victoria over the last 2 years, and in the year to March 2017, average employment grew by 3.4%. This was the strongest growth amongst the states, and in stark contrast to the average employment growth for the rest of the nation at just 0.6%. Victoria's total employment expanded by 554,000 over the 10 years from 2006 to 2016, which represented almost a third of Australia's total employment growth over the period. In 2016 alone, Victorian employment growth exceeded all other states and territories combined. These employment gains have also been broadly based. Regional employment grew by 2.1% in 2016, more than double the national average employment growth of 1%. Victoria's regional labour market is one of the strongest in the nation. At a time of substantial economic and social change, it is significant, for example, that the Latrobe Valley and Gippsland experienced employment growth in the year to March of over 14%. The Victorian economy is undergoing a period of sustained structural change. Over the past 25 years, Victoria has managed a significant transition away from a reliance on industries such as manufacturing to a broader-based service-led economy with strong jobs growth in the professional services, education and health sectors. This chart shows employment growth across Victorian industry sectors over the past 5 years, with the largest circles representing those sectors with the strongest employment growth. The employment figures are plotted according to the percentage of the industry workforce with a post-school qualification, which is the horizontal axis, against full-time adult total weekly earnings, which is the vertical axis. Employees in the industries located in the top right quadrant of the chart earn above the average weekly wage with a more highly qualified workforce than the state average. The new jobs behind Victoria's strong overall employment growth are predominantly in the higher skill, higher wage industries. In 2016, a higher proportion of Victorians had a post-school qualification than was the case in any other state. However, while the opportunity presented by structural economic change is a positive story, this change also comes with its own sets of challenges. Victoria's headline unemployment rate, currently at 6.1%, can mask significant pockets of disadvantage. Unemployment remains persistently above 15% in a number of areas of Melbourne. The areas with the highest unemployment rates across Greater Melbourne include Broadmeadows at 24%, Meadow Heights at 22%, and Dandenong and Doveton both at 19%. It is no coincidence that many of these areas have traditionally been home to historically high concentrations of heavy industry. While there are some geographic disparities in the distribution of the gains of economic growth, in Victoria and Australia as a whole, these gains have been more evenly distributed across income quintiles than many other advanced economies. The chart on the left of the slide, which I've nicknamed in my department the Donald Trump slide, shows the disparity in the United States between economic growth, represented by real GSP per capita, and growth in real median household incomes. As the chart shows, median wages in the United States have been largely stagnant since 1980, even though the US economy has grown considerably in that time. Conversely, in Victoria and Australia as a whole, the gains from economic growth have been more evenly distributed. Median Australian wages are more than 60% higher in real terms than they were in 1980, much more closely tracking the increase in the size of the economy. The relationship between inflation, wages and unemployment has been one of the more interesting features of the Victorian labour market in recent years. Traditionally, economists have observed a strong relationship between the rate of change in inflation and the unemployment rate, with inflation stabilising at an unemployment rate consistent with the economy operating at its output potential. This has also meant a close relationship between wage growth and the unemployment rate, shown inverted on this chart. This relationship held strongly for Victoria even in the recent past. However, the relationship between wages, inflation and unemployment has changed markedly in the years since, displaying a very weak relationship since 2014. This breakdown in the employment-inflation relationship is consistent with the experience of other advanced economies in the years following the global financial crisis, in part due to a moderation of inflationary expectations in an environment of lower for longer and rounds of quantitative easing by central banks. I'll now turn to some slides outlining the fiscal outlook in the budget. This budget meets the government's three key fiscal sustainability targets: strong surpluses across the budget and forward estimates, net debt peaking at 6% of GSP, consistent with statements made by the Treasurer to borrow for productivity-enhancing infrastructure up to a cap of 6%, and average revenue growth exceeding average expenditure growth over the budget and forward estimates. The general government sector operating surplus is estimated to be $1.2 billion in 2017-18, with surpluses expected to grow over the forward estimates, averaging $2.4 billion over the following 3 years. Now, while these surpluses add to $8.3 billion over the next 4 years, it is important to note that the state's operating result and net debt position are not independent. One actually affects the other. A dollar spent of the surplus leads to a dollar increase in net debt. You can't spend the surplus without increasing net debt. We have a slide malfunction. Oh, there we go. So, I'm often asked, where does all the money come from? So this pie chart tries to tell that story. So despite sustained below-trend inflation weighing on nominal GSP, revenue continues to grow, with revenue growing by 4.4% in 2017-18 to a total of $63.4 billion. Major contributors to revenue growth in the budget year include land transfer duty, or stamp duty on property transactions, and payroll tax, buoyed by a robust housing market and strong employment growth. GST revenue, which makes up around 1/4 of Victoria's total revenue is also forecast to grow by 8% in 2017-18 to $14.7 billion. This is driven by growth in Victoria's population and an increase in Victoria's GST relativity. It is also worth noting that land transfer duty, while an important source of revenue for us here in Victoria, accounts for only 10% of Victoria's total revenue base. The majority of the total revenue is spent on health and education, around 54%. Public order and safety and transport and communications make up another quarter of total government expenditure, with the remainder spent on services including housing and the environment. This totals $62.3 billion in 17-18, $1.2 billion lower than total revenue, hence the operating surplus. Victoria's own tax and royalties revenue per capita lies around the midpoint of all states and territories, which is shown by the grey shaded area on this chart. And it will remain so over the forward estimates. At the top of the range shown by the grey area is Western Australia, which is a key reason why they in WA receive a substantially lower share of GST revenue per capita, to equalise the very high level of own source revenue available to that state compared to other states and territories. Net debt is expected to be $28.9 billion by June 2021. As a proportion of gross state product, or the size of the economy, net debt is projected to increase from its June 2017 level of 4.6% to 6%. This is consistent with maintaining the state's AAA credit rating and the Treasurer's commitment that debt rise no higher than 6% of GSP. Maintaining Victoria's AAA credit rating is an important objective for the state. The AAA rating enhances our access to financial markets, particularly in times of market stress when access to funds can be more limited. The AAA rating also enhances the financial reputation of the state of Victoria abroad and also improves business confidence at home. The increase in net debt from 4.8% in last year's budget to 6% reflects increased investment in new infrastructure. This is consistent with the 2016-17 medium-term asset investment strategy set out by the government in last year's budget. Average infrastructure investment has risen compared to the decade to 2016 and will average $9.6 billion a year over the budget and forward estimates. I'd like now to focus on a couple of risks to Victoria's economic and fiscal outlook: the global uncertainty and the housing market. There is no doubt we enter 2017 amidst a period of economic and political turbulence, probably unprecedented in recent years. The rise of political populism in Europe and North America has already tested the resilience of international institutions and challenged the global consensus on issues from trade to migration. Now, one thing I know for certain about the global outlook is that I don't really know with any certainty what will actually happen. But regardless of how the events unfold and their long-term impact, global markets are likely to be marked by significantly increased volatility in the near term. However, Victoria is relatively well placed to weather global external shocks. Our prosperity and economy is broadly based, underpinned by an increasingly diverse economy better placed to withstand stress events. Recent GSP growth has been supported by very strong population growth, an easing Australian dollar supporting business conditions and exports, and low interest rates strengthening dwelling investment. Sharp movements in the Victorian housing market are, of course, a risk to the Victorian economy and fiscal outlook. However, it is very difficult to pick the direction the Victorian property market will take over the next few years. This chart shows the relationship between interest rates and quarterly Victorian land transfer duty. A faster than anticipated normalisation of Australian monetary policy does have the potential to weigh on the economic and fiscal outlook. However, to keep these risks into perspective, land transfer duty, as I have previously indicated, represents only 10% of total revenue in the budget and is forecast to increase by only 2.4% in 2017-18. So even a 10% fall in stamp duty revenue against current forecasts over the next 4 years, and in the absence of any action taken by governments, would still mean operating surpluses averaging around $1.4 billion a year over the budget and forward estimates. To take account of risks to the housing market, we have taken a prudent approach to forecasting land transfer duty. We certainly don't assume that the current buoyancy in the residential housing market will last forever. As shown on this chart, the revenue forecasts included in the budget assume that annual price growth will ease from recent highs to be below the historical average of 8%. Similarly, the budget forecasts assume property transaction volumes will gradually return to trend in line with population growth. There we go. The 2017-18 budget funds $9.6 billion in new output initiatives and $6.1 billion in new capital investment. Key among these are $2.5 billion in new health output initiatives, $2.2 billion in new output funding for justice and regulation, and a $1.9 billion family violence package. In case you are struggling to read the legend on the chart, from left to right, in order, it is family violence, DEGITA, education, DELP, health and human services, and the last bar to the right is justice and regulation. To enable the government to invest in priority areas, including family violence, the budget also includes $1.35 billion in whole-of-government efficiencies over 4 years. Public sector departments have been asked to deliver savings in the areas of administration, procurement, and consultancies. Sorry about that, Dean. The budget allocates $1.9 billion towards implementing the government's response to the Royal Commission into family violence. The funding will help establish a network of support and safety hubs, fund after-hours crisis support and financial counselling, and help build long-term social housing and modernise and expand crisis accommodation. It will also help establish specialist family violence courts at Ballarat, Frankston, Shepparton, Moorabbin and Heidelberg Magistrates Courts. And it will provide more than $131 million to protect vulnerable children, many of whom have experienced or witnessed family violence. The budget commits $2.4 billion in community safety measures, including new police recruits, new police stations, the strengthening of the youth justice precincts, and improved public transport safety. This includes funding for over 2,700 new police officers, upgrading 10 police stations across the state, and 100 new protective service officers. The budget also includes $361 million to strengthen the youth justice precincts in Parksville and Malmesbury. The budget invests a further $2.9 billion in health, including $1.3 billion to fund 41,000 additional admissions and 38,000 emergency treatments. $429 million in hospital infrastructure, including $163 million for Stage 2 of the Northern Hospital redevelopment, together with funding for the Monash Medical Centre Emergency Department and upgrades at the Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Austin Hospital, and $26 million to improve ambulance response times. The budget commits $1.3 billion to further the government's education state agenda, including $270 million to construct, plan and buy land for new schools, $240 million to upgrade schools across the state, $51 million to help teachers and principals in 346 struggling schools, and $87 million in kindergarten programs for disadvantaged children. Infrastructure investment funded in this budget averages $9.6 billion over 4 years. This includes $700 million to upgrade the M80 Ring Road. It also includes $880 million for improving public transport services, including $218 million for new E-Class trams. The budget also invests in planning for future projects, including $100 million for pre-planning and pre-construction of the North East Link. The budget also provides funding for the government's housing affordability package titled Homes for Victorians, which was announced by the Treasurer on the 5th of March this year. This includes supporting 2,200 new social housing places over the next 5 years through a $1 billion social housing growth fund and a further $1 billion in government guarantees to housing associations. This is in addition to doubling the first homeowner grant in regional Victoria and $851 million to abolish stamp duty for first home buyers on homes up to $60,000 and cuts to stamp duty on homes valued up to $750,000. On top of the tax measures including the government's housing package, the budget also includes tax relief, particularly for businesses in regional Victoria. In particular, the budget brings forward previously announced increases in the payroll tax threshold by 1 year, with the threshold rising to $650,000 from 1 July 2018, benefiting around 37,800 businesses with a payroll tax liability. The budget also reduces the payroll tax rate by 25% for businesses with at least 85% of their payroll made up of regional employees. This will mean Victoria has the lowest payroll tax rate across all states for regional businesses at 3.65%. So in summary, today I've discussed the outlook for the Victorian economy, briefly explained Victoria's financial position, outlined some of the risks to the economic and fiscal outlook, and highlighted some of the key initiatives in the budget. In a time of national economic transition and a changing and uncertain global environment, Victoria's finances remain strong, our economic fundamentals are sound, and we do remain well positioned to face these challenges and opportunities in the years ahead. So just finally, I would like to publicly thank and acknowledge particularly the staff of my department, Treasury and Finance, a few who are here this morning, I suspect after very little sleep. There's been a lot of hard work in the department, and I certainly want to thank all of you that are here today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David, for that presentation, a fantastic summary of the budget for 17-18. State budgets are a great vehicle for governments to establish their credentials and to set their priorities. It's not just a collection of numbers, it's an expression of values and aspirations. It also allows us as a public sector, and I say us in the broad sense there obviously, to pause and reflect on its activities and the resources it consumes in delivering outcomes for the Victorian community. Delivering a state budget is a huge undertaking in itself, involving many hours of preparation, deliberation and decision making. And it's great to see that Treasury and Finance has delivered the goods again in terms of a budget that fulfils the government's fiscal parameters, but also provides the VPS with its policy direction for the 4 years ahead. Of course, there are numbers in the budget, and they are impressive. I think sometimes we forget just how significant government can be in the lives of all Victorians, but also in terms of the economy. Over 1 in every 100 Australians works for the Victorian public sector. 1 in 100 Australians. In the next financial year, as David mentioned, the general government sector will have $62.2 billion of operating expenditure. That's $1.2 billion a week. The capital program touching $10 billion in 17-18, that is significant. That's twice what we've seen in the past. That's $27 million a day pumping through the system. They are extraordinary numbers. What will the impact be, and how will it be received? Well, as Jill mentioned, we've got 2 special guest commentators this morning to help us decide that. and discuss that, Peter Martin and Danielle Wood. Now, before I welcome our first analyst to the stage, I would also remind you, as Jill mentioned, that you'll be able to send through some questions by SMS, so that number will be on the screen shortly. So Peter Martin, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Peter. A lot of us read him on a daily basis, of course. An expert in all things economic with a dash of political commentary as well. He's one of Australia's most accomplished economic journalists. I think he lives and breathes economics, having graduated with an honours degree in economics. Once worked for the Commonwealth Treasury. That puts him in very esteemed company, David, I would have thought. Was for 20 years the economic correspondent for the ABC's leading affairs, current affairs programs. And of course he's now the economics correspondent for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. He's the kind of person who puts a testimonial on his homepage from an MP complaining that he's consistently wrong. Peter, we look forward to how you might be consistently wrong for us today. Peter Martin from The Age.
Thank you, Dean. I have to point out that minister was former minister, former assistant infrastructure minister was Jamie Briggs. Actually, I put it there when he was still minister, and I thought this is good, and testimonial from a minister. When he had a fall from grace and lost his seat, I thought I'd remove it. Nah, people need to know what a disgraced minister thought. That's okay. So the Treasurer sold me the budget a few days before. He said he wanted to be like Peter Walsh, the legendary Commonwealth Finance Minister, whose mantra was, cut in the good times. And he tried to tell me how they'd done it in this budget, and I don't think they have. David has shown me the figures, and he quoted them there, the three metrics that the government tries to meet. One is that revenue should grow faster than spending over the next 4 years. The average is correct, 3.7% revenue growth, even assuming slower growth in house prices and so on. 3.2% in spending growth. What could be wrong with that? Averages can hide things. If you look at this year, by that I mean this financial year, the one that isn't yet finished, which isn't in those 4-year averages, revenue up 7%, as you'd expect with the booming house prices. Spending up 9.8%. For next year also, it's, if you like, in the wrong direction, 17-18. Revenue up 4.4%, spending up 4.8%. Now the thing about Commonwealth budget, certainly, as David would know, is the future always looks good. As someone from the Treasury, Commonwealth Treasury, said to me once, we never forecast recessions, which, by the way, isn't true. They did forecast a recession in the global financial crisis, and it didn't happen, but that's very rare. So the future always looks good, and it's those future forecasts which make the average look good. Now, there are savings. These are the ones the Treasurer talked about. Where are they, David? They're here. Ah, yes, there's one page of savings. Oh, no, it's half a page. 114, page 114 of Statement 3. Half a page. Centralised banking and cash management reform and whole of government efficiencies, procurement, communications, consultancies, staffing. They add up to $1.5 billion over 4 years. This is not what Peter Walsh would have been proud of, and these are good times. If you can go inside the bureaucracy and make savings, centralised procurement, things like that, which would be deeply unpopular for lots of departments, and do it saying you're not affecting outputs at all, that's good. But I don't think it's a test of whether you're cutting in the good times. The real test, or the other test, is to find something to cut, to say no to a request, to find something which after 3 years in government, many more years in Victoria, it's been the same sort of budget situation, to find something that is redundant, something that the government no longer needs to do. There must be something. And of course, your question, David, is, well, what? You know, you tell me. 272 million for the final stage, the next final stage of the redevelopment of Melbourne Park. They could have said no to that, but they're scared of losing the Australian Open. As if that would happen, but it's certainly a threat. 2,700 police. Now, this is a political decision, and the government's entitled to make that decision. If it had more courage, it might have said no. My colleague Tim Colbatch, who used to do this job before me, did some very rough noting in the budget, and I was reminded, Dean, when you talked about the number of people who work for the Victorian Public Service, the proportion. His rough calculations were that by 2020, 1 in every 400 Victorians would be working as a police officer. It is possible to say no, and there's no instance where the government has said no in this budget, aside from those internal departmental efficiencies, which are welcome. We see that in the debt. Now, that's, on the whole, a good thing, because what's happening to Victoria, there's that tremendous graph that you didn't show of interstate migration, of all of these arrows flooding in, net migration, and going back quite a few years, to the Kennett years, when the arrows were all pointing the other way in the aftermath of the late 80s. So the government does need to spend, does need to borrow to spend. That ceiling, that commitment it gave of 6% of debt, it will be right up against that. 6% of debt is okay. 6% of gross state product is okay. Northern Territory figures released yesterday show its projection is 20%. That's all right. New South Wales, 3.7%. Queensland, I calculated it. And you know, you do these calculations and you think, they can't be right. I got it's probably not right. You know, if a figure is so large, it's probably wrong. But I got more than 50%. So 6% is okay. Now, the questions are, what's going to happen if? Because you know, we never forecast, well, hardly ever forecast downturns. What if growth collapses, if state growth is slower? Say its gross state product is 2% instead of 2.75%. I get net debt going up to 8%. That's probably not too bad. But it breaks this commitment, but in reality it's probably not too bad. Property prices. Yes, property prices are forecast to grow more slowly, but what if they fall? It's entirely likely. On rough calculations using the ready reckoner that's at the back of the budget for various scenarios, if property prices were to fall 12%, which is possible, and if the turnover of properties was to fall 12%, I get no surplus this year, I get no surplus in 2020. In fact, I get a deficit this year. So yes, these things, stamp duty, land tax, are small as a function of spending, but They're very big in terms of their effects. They're the things that vary. It's like at the Commonwealth level, company tax is small as a proportion of income, but it's a thing that always changes. The other thing that might change is population growth. You've forecast or projected a slowing of the rapid population growth from 2% a year to 1.8. If that doesn't happen, which is also entirely likely, that's an upward surprise. So net debt as a proportion of gross state product will shrink, and the budget balance will improve quite a lot. So the future is unknown. Wary pessimists like me tend to think, what if something bad happens? Population growth, to the extent that it's good. If that doesn't slow, that'll be something that's good for the budget. And as the one of the graphs that David showed indicates, good for the state too. As unlikely as that might seem if you're actually trying to get into the city. I'm trolled on Twitter by all of these low population growth people. They say they're low population growth, but then when you talk to them, they're actually quite in favour of babies and quite in favour of people living long lives. They don't like immigration. That's what they don't like. But and they're fairly silent about interstate migration too. And the fact that net immigration is largely a function of how many Australians decide to leave, which is, or come back. But the impressive figure for me on that is that Victoria has the highest population growth in the nation and, as none of these people would have you believe, growing gross state product per capita. Now, that could be because things are booming so much in Melbourne that people are coming here and slowing a bit of it down, but it's probably that the two things are inextricably linked. So look, the future mightn't be that bad. It could be quite awful for the budget balance and gross state debt, but I don't think the Treasurer has cut in the good times. He lacks the courage to do so. The government lacks the political position to do so. It can't say no to repeated stories about crime in newspapers and TV, and it can't even say no to someone who wants an even grander tennis court. Thank you.
Well, I did promise that Peter was economic with a tad of political. I think he delivered there. David, would you like to respond perhaps just to a few points that Peter's made?
Thanks, Dean. I never thought I'd hear the day where a Treasury officer was accused of not saying no enough. I'm kind of somewhat flattered. Because there's actually a big section of the budget papers that we don't print, which kind of reflects our ability to say no. Which are they IPAA? No, they don't. Those documents don't exist. I mean, your points around risks, Peter, are, they're there. I mean, there's no question that there are risks, and as I said, it's very hard to try and anticipate and forecast. You are quite right. Treasuries do tend to be kind of optimistic, and I'm glad to see you have actually looked at the very informative sensitivity analysis in Appendix A of one of the budget documents. It's a very useful document. So there are no doubt risks, but in terms of things like the housing market and just the economy generally, population growth is pretty robust, and in fact the upside, there's probably upside risk on those forecasts would be my suggestion in 17-18. So there is actually a bit of upside potentially there through GST And that's certainly going to continue to support, I think, quite a robust housing market as well. So at the moment, certainly in the near term, it's difficult to kind of see what the trigger might be. Certainly domestically, I think interest rates are going to be on hold for probably, I suspect, another 12 months. Population growth is going to stay pretty robust. I think the biggest concern is what might happen internationally and what effects that might have. And that's something that, I mean, who knows? We could be firing nuclear missiles at each other next week. It's very unpredictable.
Does Appendix A cover that scenario, David? Or?
That was one of the bits that didn't quite make.
Okay. No, we'll
nuclear
FOI
Armageddon didn't quite make it.
Well, in the interests of balance, because we've got three relatively young male economists on stage, we thought we'd invite Danielle Wood to the stage as well. Danielle is the Australian Perspectives Fellow at the Grattan Institute, which is one of Australia's most respected think tanks. And at the Grattan, she contributes to the public debate on a range of issues, including tax and budget policy and intergenerational inequality. Everyone, Danielle Wood.
Thanks very much, Dean. Look, I'm going to start with the positives and say, I think there was a lot of very worthwhile initiatives in the budget, and particularly pick out the family violence initiative. I think it's incredibly important and one that will really make a difference to Victorians. So when I was reflecting yesterday in the lockup about potential themes for an article and today's speech, I came up with a couple. One of which Peter has well and truly moved into, but I will just kind of make some points that reiterate some of what Peter has said. First of all, the very healthy budget numbers that David has been talking about are really on the back of rising revenues. And I put out some old budget papers yesterday going back 10 years, and over that time, after adjusting for inflation, property tax revenues have grown 70%. So it's extremely healthy growth. And as revenues have grown as a share of gross state product, we've seen expenses broadly track along with them. So we've gone from a world back in the early 2000s where both state revenues and expenses sat at about 10% of gross state product to today, and over the forecast, we're about 15% of gross state product. So basically the size of government in Victoria has grown significantly over that period. And I think to some degree that's expected. We look around the world and we see that as countries get richer, they tend to spend a higher share of their output on education and particularly on health. What does the Victorian government do? Well, it's a big deliverer of health and education. That's around half its spending. So to some degree we expect that as the economy grows, the Victorian government will grow as a share of that. But that said, I think coming to Peter's point, it does reflect perhaps a lack of willingness to really turn the screw on spending, particularly when the times are good. The reason it matters, Peter has gone to, revenues are highly uncertain, particularly property tax revenues. The Commonwealth is an excellent lesson in not locking in high spending against uncertain revenues. And I also had a very good look at Appendix A and did the same calculations that Peter did. So the point is just that it doesn't take much of a property market correction to wipe out surpluses of $1 or $2 billion. The other point I wanted to go to was infrastructure spending, and I think it's hard not to be struck by the chart that David put up looking at spending over the next 4 years compared to where we've been at over the decade. And I think, as an economist, I always welcome good infrastructure spending. So spending that increases the capacity of the economy, as long as the economic boost is greater than the interest and depreciation, then that's a good thing for Victoria. But absolutely pivotal in that is project selection. And the transport team at Grattan put out a report last year highlighting, I think, what can only be described as systematic failures in project selection for transport infrastructure right around the country. So I would just like to put in a strong plug for Infrastructure Victoria for objective cost-benefit analysis and trying to take some of those political considerations out of infrastructure spending. The other real feature of the budget papers yesterday, I think, was the frustration of the Victorian government at what it views as not getting its fair share of infrastructure spending. And I think last year I was here, I put up a report also from that Grattan Roads to Riches report that basically looks at infrastructure spending per capita by state over the past decade, and then overlays that with a picture of marginal electorates from the last federal election. And you will see there's a very close correlation between those two things. So I absolutely understand the sense of frustration that is there. However, I do think the ultimate impact is overstated. There was a discussion in the budget papers of 6.6 billion in missing funding. Obviously, when the GST allocation formula works its magic, a lot of that comes back through higher relativities, and we're already seeing that impact from past low spending flow through. So in summary, I think it's a solid set of numbers. I think we should be doing more on the expenses side. I think we should be running bigger surpluses in order to create a buffer if things in the economy or the property market go south. And I welcome the infrastructure spending, but just reiterate that project selection is absolutely key.
Thanks, Danielle. Now, we're going to have an opportunity in a moment for people on the floor to send some questions through by SMS, but perhaps just to get the ball rolling a little bit, population growth, both Peter and Danielle in particular mentioned it, David showed the chart. I've been to a few places around the country recently where they'd give anything for a little bit of population growth, but obviously it brings its challenges. Do you think Victorian government, this budget, is doing enough to address those issues, to be ahead of the curve, to plan for what is a significant growth in the city and the state as a whole over the next 4 years?
I'm not sure I can say whether they're doing enough. I can certainly say that clearly a lot of the infrastructure initiatives in the budget are targeted at that problem, and it's certainly welcome to see a focus on city and urban infrastructure as well as regional infrastructure to address those problems. But I will go back to the point that I make always, which is, to address that in the most efficient way possible, we need to choose the right projects. Using benefit cost analysis, using Infrastructure Victoria is going to be the way that we make sure that that problem is best addressed. And Peter, an extension of that, your readers in The Age, Victorians more generally, do you think they have an understanding of the implications of that population growth and whose responsibility it is to address it?
I think they feel it very deeply as they are trying to get into Melbourne from the country or into the city. I think the government's right to deal with these things, and I think that's one of the cases where the political imperative is exactly what the state needs. Now, you were telling me earlier, David, that Infrastructure Victoria actually doesn't do what Danielle thinks it should do, which is detailed cost-benefit analysis. And in a sense, you can't... People have suggested at various times that Infrastructure Australia or Infrastructure Victoria should decide, a bit like the Reserve Bank, it should decide, this is the best project, you can't remove the politicians from that, because otherwise there's nothing left for them to do. They're inherently and rightly political decisions about where they spend big bits of money. But David, what is the situation at the moment? How does it work out if the Premier thinks we need a rail line here, and what bodies, either Infrastructure Victoria or Infrastructure Australia or anybody, will decide whether or not that's the best use of money, and how does that play out?
Okay, just to make a few points on that, and I agree with you, Peter, at the end of the day, governments need to make the decisions about projects, so that's essentially what they are there for. Just because Infrastructure Victoria don't do detailed business cases on particular projects doesn't mean that they're not prepared. So all the major projects have detailed business cases prepared with BCRs. Where the state of Victoria is trying to seek Commonwealth funding, they are submitted to Infrastructure Australia, because that is one of the Commonwealth requirements to receive funding. Not that we actually get much in return, but we do submit them. So we have submitted over the last couple of years detailed business cases up to Canberra. So they are certainly prepared by the bureaucracy, and they are considered by government, and the government is very conscious in making those decisions to try and direct the effort to those projects that are, producing a positive BCR above 1. Just the other comment I might make, just coming back, Dean, to your question about population growth, and it is hard to try and determine what is the appropriate level of infrastructure investment and government spending to keep pace with population growth. Very hard thing to work out, but given the strong population growth, it's not, to me, that surprising that not only do we have a large increase in infrastructure investment, but we are actually seeing, particularly over the last couple of years, a large, in a relative sense, increase in output spending. So to me, it's not actually surprising to see expenses growing quite strongly last year and the year before.
Teachers.
Yeah. With strong population growth, you do need to employ more teachers, you need to employ more police, so you are going to see that with the population increasing.
That's right, it's 1,500, 2,000 people a week, and with that brings demand for services. David, in your presentation you touched on IPAA just a little bit in terms of it being still an important fiscal parameter, creating confidence, access to markets, and I think in the GFC 10 years ago, Victoria having AAA was a crucial factor in its ability to sustain that downturn and to sustain government services. What's going to happen if the Australian government loses its AAA? To what extent will that have an impact on the Victorian government's position?
Very interesting question. There's probably a difference between what will happen and what should happen. So the Commonwealth does have a AAA credit rating similar to Victoria, and Standard & Poor's have put them on negative watch, and the view of Standard & Poor's is if they put a sovereign on negative watch, any sub-sovereigns with a similar AAA are also put on negative watch. So as a consequence of Standard & Poor's putting the Commonwealth on negative watch, Victoria, New South Wales and the ACT were also automatically put on negative watch, even though there was no change in the state's finances or economy. There are a couple of very rare examples around the world. There's one in Spain, I think there's one in the United States as well, where a sub-sovereign does actually have a higher rating than the sovereign. Our view is that we don't think the state of Victoria should be downgraded if the Commonwealth is downgraded, and there's actually a very well drafted box in the budget papers that outlines the case for that. And the discussions we've had with S&P, including earlier this week, and we'll be having some more in a couple of weeks, is we actually don't think Victoria is as dependent on the Commonwealth as perhaps they think. The GST, which does constitute about 23% of the state's finances, in substance is a state tax. Yes, it's collected by the Commonwealth, but it's passed to the states, and it cannot be unilaterally adjusted by the Commonwealth. I mean, they could go to Parliament and try and get something through to clip the ticket on the way of 10% or something, but that's not going to happen. So you're then left with our dependency, which is about 24% of grants. As was mentioned earlier, and it's been in the press for several days, we actually don't get much from them in terms of infrastructure. Our population share is 25%, and we get at the moment 8.5%. So there's probably not much, you'd hope not much more scope for cutting there for Victoria. We're the only state, by the way, that doesn't get our state share of the current pot of infrastructure funding. So beyond that, you're down to the normal grant programs of health and education, and they were cut by the Commonwealth a couple of years ago. There was a big announcement yesterday which we didn't know really much about until yesterday. We're still trying to work out what it all means. But so obviously what concerns rating agencies is if for the Commonwealth to get budget repair, they cut things that impact on the states, including Victoria. But at the moment, our discussion with S&P is really to say to them, we just can't see if the Commonwealth is forced to do that, it would have a significant impact on our finances, particularly given the strong state of the Victorian economy. So we pointed in the right direction of the very well crafted box in the budget papers, and hopefully that will change their thinking, but we probably won't know until mid-year. And that'll be about the time we'll get a view out of them on what they might do with the Commonwealth.
All right, thanks, Dave. Now, am I supposed to be receiving questions? Thank you. That's all right. And anyone seeing my family over the next few weeks, please don't tell my daughters that I was using technology before 9 a.m. It's a rule in our household. Now, Danielle, the ACT government's policy decision to convert stamp duty on property conveyancing to land tax over a 20-year period, obviously a slow transition, but is that something that you think other state jurisdictions should be looking at? Is it something that a state like Victoria should also be considering?
Yes, is the short answer. We've been very strong advocates, as are, I think, most economists, of transitioning from stamp duties to land taxes. Stamp duties are incredibly inefficient taxes. They deter people from moving. That includes moving closer to jobs. It includes downsizing your homes to free up housing stock. In contrast, land taxes are probably the most efficient taxes you can get. So we'd be very strongly supportive of any such move by the Victorian government. It is interesting the ACT government has done it over such a long period. I think there is certainly a case in terms of adjustment and compensating people that have recently moved for transitioning over time. I do wonder if by taking such a long period, they're giving themselves a bit more political pain than perhaps they might have otherwise. There's a lot of those annual statements coming to get through. But that said, I think it seems to be working reasonably well there, and is certainly something that Victoria, we would hope, would consider in the future.
Thanks, Danielle. We obviously have some VicPol people in the crowd because they're sending through the VicPol advertising website for people who are looking for a new job. David, a few people are just asking your view, Treasury's views on likely outcomes from the family violence investment, which was obviously a massive investment relative to past budgets, relative to other states.
That's a good question. So, addressing family violence has obviously been a key priority for this government. So they set up the Royal Commission, which reported, and the government is essentially committed to implementing all of the recommendations of the Royal Commission. There was a investment made last year in last year's budget, 500 to 600 million over a couple of years. The 1.91 billion is the next instalment in that in the government's investment in addressing the Royal Commission's recommendations. It is actually quite a substantive increase in investment that has been made in the state. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done, particularly in the next 12 months, in terms of rolling out the whole series of initiatives. Some of them are very complex. The new hubs that need to be set up across the state. There's a commitment in the budget that identifies the first hubs that will be set up both in Melbourne and Victoria. They're going to be quite critical to the success of the investment over the next 4 years. So it is a very big investment, a very big reform, which will just have to be carefully rolled out.
Thanks, Dave. Peter, a couple of questions here about the interplay between Commonwealth and state governments, the election cycles, the role of a state government in the economy. Your views as an economist and someone who writes really on issues at both levels of government.
The Commonwealth has got to do what Victoria does and go to 4-year fixed terms. Really has to, because it seems like the Commonwealth election was just last year. Oh heavens, it was. And already, we're talking about this budget as being like this Victorian budget, the one where they get to do things before the pre-election budget, which is right, because they might have an election at the end of next year. So, and also given that the fact that the two elections are often not at the same time, are often at different years, the overlap means that at least for as far as the Commonwealth relations go, almost nothing gets done. I actually think that's one of the biggest, easiest reforms we could have. And I speak against my interests as a political journalist, you know. Instability and government inaction and stories about it, you know, sort of great to write about, but wouldn't it be great if they could actually govern, deal with Victoria behind the scenes without, as I think this is part of the idea the Treasurer has said about regional rail, that given the scars of the East-West link and the metro, that the feds can't possibly have anything against regional rail. After all, you know, a lot of them National Party MPs, that behind the scenes they might be able to agree to fund that. That kind of getting on with it stuff would be much more possible with that simple reform.
David, a couple of questions about climate change, not getting a huge mention. The environment spend in this budget, did it play a big part in budget deliberations?
It's hard to comment, and I won't, on all of the deliberations in the Cabinet room, but it is, I think, a fair observation that yes, there is some initiatives that deal with the environment, but the government has, in this budget, set its priorities in terms of family violence, community safety, health, education and infrastructure. And that's in a sense what budgets are about. You know, it's the budget of the day reflects the choices of the government of the day, and they're the choices that the government has made in this budget. But there are initiatives outlined in Budget Paper 3, for those that are interested, in the DELP section, that will outline some new measures on the environment.
Can I ask you, David, an environment question that you won't be able to answer, which is why they've decided to explore for gas, onshore gas, when they have a moratorium on it? Yeah, I didn't think you'd be able to.
Yeah, you are correct, Peter. I can't answer that question.
And I would answer the question, but you've just cut the consultancy budget, so I won't be able to do that. All right, now we might just have one last question here. They're flying through. Thank you for everyone for sending them through. Interesting one here. A lot of focus on budgets, i.e. the front end of the process, what we're going to do. A few people are saying who reports on how it went and the impact it has. Throw that open to perhaps all of you.
Certainly in terms of how it went in terms of forecasting, we've been doing at Grattan a lot of looking back over the Commonwealth forecasts, and it very much substantiates Peter's point that they tend to be very optimistic, particularly in the out years. So, you know, if you go back to budgets since 2009 at the Commonwealth level, what we see is governments each year saying, well, yes, we're running a deficit today, but don't worry, because in years 3 and 4, the budget will be back in surplus. When those years roll around, what do we see? Guess what? Continued deficits. So we've done a lot of work talking about, you know, how that optimism bias, which seems to be built into the forecast, is actually taking away the momentum for serious budget repair that needs to occur. So we hope that we're holding governments to account in that regard. In terms of the, you know, particular policy initiatives, you know, there's certainly groups like the Productivity Commission that monitor what's going on and the efficiency and effectiveness of various forms of spending. But I don't know if there's sort of anyone that holistically looks at the budget 5 years down the track and says, you know, did it deliver what it said it was going to deliver?
Do you think there's optimism bias?
We have, I think there is a bit, but we have made a very conscious decision to try and ensure that our estimates are as central as they can become. And a comment I often say to the Treasurer is, I try and ensure that there's a 50% chance that our land transfer duty revenue estimate will be above or below. Now, some of these things are very hard to estimate, and there is inbuilt amongst all modelers, no disrespect to them, a couple sitting here this morning, that you do tend to be a little bit on the optimistic side, but we are consciously trying to endeavour to ensure that we come up with central estimates, but it is hard.
All right, look, we might have to leave it there. It is 5 minutes to 9, and we promised to get everyone back at their desks so that they can start the expenditure that we referred to earlier. But look, I just personally want to thank David, obviously, for his ongoing support of the morning, but to Peter and Danielle in particular, it's fantastic to get that external perspective, and we've got two of Australia's best economic commentators here, so thank you very much for your contribution this morning.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you so much to David, Peter and Danielle. In a way, I think that conversation embodied the sorts of factors that governments have to take into account as they do budgets. Dean started by talking about governments' budgets embodying values, and I think they do embody the values of the government of the day, but also the community expectations and both current pressing issues and a forward look, and getting that balance right and then having it analysed from a range of perspectives is a pretty big process. I think if I heard Peter right, that is the first time I might have heard a working journalist suggest that government should take newspapers out of the decision-making equation, so it's kind of interesting. But I do think we're very lucky to have had that opportunity to hear those perspectives this morning. So on behalf of IPAA Victoria, can you please thank our panel again? Just as we finish, I just want to take the opportunity to mention IPAA's Victoria Public Sector Week 2017, which kicks off on the 14th of August at the Sofitel. There's some material on your tables about it. This is a huge event for us. It's something that we did for the first time 2 years ago. It is an opportunity to profile and engage in things that are important in the public sector in Victoria over the course of a week. Over that week, at one-day events in Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo, you'll have the opportunity to listen to some of our most erudite speakers and thought leaders from across Australia for a series of different events. There's debates, hackathons, interactive forums, and a whole range of different ways in which people at all levels in the public sector can engage in a whole range of topics. Things that go from initiatives and technologies that are driving innovation culture in our sector, the ethics of governments using nudging and behavioural science, the role of place-based approaches, the rise of citizen juries, and a whole series of others. There'll be thought leadership sessions on the big issues that face our sector and the community. There's more information at your table, but also please have a look at our website, which is now up and running. The registration's open on the 15th of May, and I would encourage you to think about yourself, your colleagues, your staff, participating in what promises to be a very stimulating series of events over the course of that week. And with that, I'd like to thank you again for attending our breakfast and wish you a good day ahead. Thank you.